Odysseus and his men come to the floating island of King Aeolus, who Zeus has made master of the winds. After hosting them for a month, King Aeolus stuffed all the winds into a bag, except a favorable west wind, and gave it to Odysseus. Leaving the island, they sailed for 9 days until they came so close to Ithaca they could see men tending fires on the shore. Odysseus's men, however, open the bag of winds, causing a maelstrom, blowing them all the way back to King Aeolus's island. The king rejects them as cursed by the gods, and Odysseus and his fleet sail to the island of the Laestrygonians. There, Odysseus's entire fleet, save his own ship, is lost in a surprise attack by the man-eating inhabitants of the island. Odysseus's lone ship comes upon a new island, and Odysseus's men find a hall and hear a woman singing inside. The woman is Circe, a goddess, who welcomes all the men to a feast and then changes them into pigs. Eurylochus, the only one not to go into the hall, runs back and tells Odysseus. Odysseus sets off to the hall, but along the way runs into Hermes, the messenger god, who tells him how to overcome Circe's spells. Odysseus obeys, and Circe is made to swear an oath she will not harm Odysseus. Odysseus's men are restored, younger and more handsome. They remain guests of Circe's house for a year, until Odysseus's men remind him of his journey home. The book ends with Circe telling Odysseus he must travel to the house of death and speak to the prophet Tiresias. All right, welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. We're very happy to have you today as we discuss Book 10 of Homer's Odyssey. Visit us on Twitter, or X as it is, and also visit our website where we have a whole bunch of resources, a library dedicated to the great books, which includes a question and answer guide to help you or your small group work through the Odyssey. Today, Adam Minahan is out. He is at a conference. He often goes and speaks at Catholic conferences around the country. So he is out today. And then we were also supposed to have Dr. Jennifer Frey, who is the current dean of the new Honors College at the University of Tulsa, a wonderful new program, a great books-based program. However, her family is sick and she is taking care of her children today. So it will be me, and I will be leading you through Book 10 of the Odyssey. Okay, so let's get into the text. So Book 10, we have several kind of famous narratives. The first one that we have is King Aeolus. Now this guy's interesting. He is, as far as we can tell during the Homeric period, a mortal. But he's a mortal that Zeus has given custody or mastery of the winds. And so he's on this, it's like a floating island, and it's covered, it has like a brass, if I remember right, decking around it. So the island floats, but there's like this brass that they can, climb up, etc., onto the island. And this guy, King Aeolus, is the master of the winds. And so he feasts them, he hosts them, he's a good host. And so what he does then is he says, hey, I'll help you get back to Ithaca. And he kind of just hits the easy button. And so he says, we'll take all the winds except the one that you need, and we'll put it in a bag. And then what they need is a favorable west wind to take them all the way back to Ithaca. And then we get this almost, just infuriating passage, almost heartbreaking passage, right? In which Odysseus and his fleet get so close to Ithaca that they see the men tending the fires on the shore. Now, what happens next, I think, is incredibly important. On a broad scale, right, what most people remember is that Odysseus falls asleep. So he's not, prepared. He's not actually doing anything to prevent his men because he has decided that he has to sail the ship all the way back to Ithaca himself. And so, of course, he falls asleep right before they get there. And his men are convinced that the bag is actually full of treasure and that Odysseus is not, he's not sharing it, right? He's hoarding the treasure. One thinks here of some of the problems we saw in the Iliad with Agamemnon. And so there's a distrust. And I think that's a theme that I really want to pick up here, is that we're fresh off the Cyclops narrative. We're fresh off this narrative in which Odysseus's decisions caused what? 6 of his men to be eaten by the Cyclops, to suffer this horrific death. And then, of course, when he's leaving the island, right, he actually tells the Cyclops his name. His men are begging him to stop talking. The Cyclops is throwing boulders, and it's getting very close to the ship. And then we get this curse, in which the Cyclops curses Odysseus and his journey home, mainly because Odysseus told him his name. And again, the curse is a call down. It's a prayer to the Cyclops' father, who is Poseidon. And so we have to keep in mind that we're coming fresh off of this narrative, and we have a lot of questions, as we discussed in Book 9, of Odysseus' leadership. And so now you kind of see this tension. You see that he doesn't want to give, he doesn't want to give Captain, the word's not coming to me. He doesn't want to let anyone else lead the ship, right? He has to sail the ship all the way back, which, if I remember right, if you look at like line 32 or so, it's 9 days. It's 9 nights that they're actually at sailing, that he doesn't sleep because he won't give over the ship to anyone else. So of course, like, there's this distrust, there's this broken relationship. And we kind of, particularly in Book 10, start to see how broken this relationship is. And that will become very thematic as we work through Odysseus retelling his tale to King Alcinous, right? That's what's happening right now. He's retelling his tale, what has happened to him, to King Alcinous and his court. So let's look further at this narrative of the Bag of Winds. One thing that is certainly worth pointing out is not only just the distrust that has entered in between the two, between Odysseus and his men, but notice also in Book 10, we're going to have a strong theme of spirit, of thumos, right? The thumas, the spirit of man. And we've talked about this. This is in certain ways embodies his grit, his ability to endure things for the sake of honor and glory, but it also kind of represents, in a certain way, his soul at large, right? So when they have like a spirit of man, it's his thumos. When we get into Plato later on, Plato takes this and turns it more into a term of art. He turns it into a part of the soul that's willing to undergo difficult things for the sake of human excellence, for glory, for honor. And from that comes a certain immortality. It comes the immortality of having that fame. This is what we saw with Achilles, right? Achilles wanted, he ultimately chose that fame that he would find in the Trojan War, and that he wanted that fame more than going back and having a family and having a peaceful life. So notice the theme, though, I think in Book 10, of thumos, of spirit. We see it here in line 55 or so with Odysseus, that he got so close to home, the men open the bag, it causes a squall or a maelstrom and sweeps them back, the whole fleet, back to King Aeolus's island. But notice at like 55, he says, "And I awoke with a start, my spirit churning. Should I leap over the side and drown at once, or grit my teeth and bear it and stay among the living?" So here Odysseus is contemplating suicide. He's contemplating, would it not be better just to cast myself into the sea and die at this point, in this desperation? But his spirit, his thumos, is able to overcome this antagonism, to overcome this difficulty, and continue on in his journey home. Another big theme in Book 10 is the theme of guest friendship. So we've been tracking this throughout the Odyssey. It plays a very pivotal role. It's going to play a pivotal role in basically all 3 major narratives inside of Book 10. And it's interesting because we've already seen King Aeolus welcomed Odysseus. He welcomed Odysseus' men. He was a good host. As far as we understand, he feasted them, and he sent them back with a gift, a wonderful gift that sped them away all the way back to Ithaca. But notice when Odysseus and his men return, notice how King Aeolus welcomes them, for lack of a better word. He actually says, basically, what are you doing here? Why are you back? And Odysseus blames his crew. He says, "The mutinous crew undid me. That and cruel sleep. Set it to right, my friends. You have the power." So basically, like, I'm really sorry. My men basically mutinied, and I was asleep. And can you basically do the same thing again? Can you stuff all these winds back in a bag and send us home? Notice the king's response. He says, "Away from my island, fast, most cursed man alive. It's a crime to host a man or speed him on his way, when the blessed deathless gods despise him so, crawling back like this. In certain ways, this provides us a new insight into that guest friendship, that xenia, because we've always said, listen, the guest friendship, the reason it's taken so seriously is because they are this whole dynamic of host and guest is overseen by the gods, particularly under Zeus. And so, if you welcome the stranger, he might be a god in disguise, etc. And it's Zeus then that ultimately is noticing how the guest and the host interact with each other, and are they both playing their part, these parts of hospitality. So typically then when we see a perversion of guest friendship, when we see something, we flag it. The greatest perversion I think we've seen thus far of guest friendship is the Cyclops, right, of Odysseus going into the Cyclops cave, which I think is, a disordered, a perversion of the guest, right? Can we get a gift out of this guy? Can we manipulate him? All of a sudden it ends up being a Cyclops. And there's this kind of horrific juxtaposition, almost an irony, in which then the host eats his guest, right? He doesn't feast his guest. The guest becomes the feast, and the Cyclops devours 6 of the men. So usually when we see like these deviations from the guest friendship, they've been a perversion, and the gods have punished someone. But notice here we're seeing a new aspect, which is, well, what if the guest is actually cursed by the gods? What if the gods don't want the guest to be welcomed? Notice that it's not even just that the king doesn't have to welcome them, that he might have a choice to say, listen, I think you're cursed by the gods, I shouldn't welcome you. It's actually a duty. It's a proactive duty not to do this, because to do so is actually contextualized as a crime, right? He says it's a crime to host a man or speed him on his way, when the blessed deathless gods despise him so. And so now we see this new aspect of guest friendship, that there is a reason that a host may reject a guest, and that reason is that the guest is despised by the gods. And so Odysseus and his men now, right, they have to leave, and they have to kind of wander back to figure out how to make it to Ithaca. So let's look at their next adventure. The next island that they come to is the Laestrygonian island. And notice too, we're kind of tracking this theme of their thumos, their spirit. A little bit before line 90, it says the crew's spirit is broken. It's broken. And I think that's a key theme. And we're going to see this kind of play up time and time again, right? They're having to undergo the same temptation that Odysseus went under. He elected not to cast himself into the sea, to not commit suicide. He's going to endure. And his men are basically faced with that same temptation. We might throw out the thesis that they're not going to do as well as he does. So they come to the Laestrygonian island. And basically, in short, what happens here is that the island has like a cove, like a safe harbor, if you will, that all the fleet can enter into. And the fleet goes into this safe harbor, but Odysseus, this man of twists and turns, he holds his ship back, right? He holds his ship back, and he wants to know more about this situation. So he sends men scouting. So his whole fleet's in the safe harbor. He sends men from his ship to go scout the island. Is this a safe island? And what we get here, right, is a very fascinating narrative. They come and they do. They find basically a princess, a girl drawing water. And she takes them then to the palace, if you want to call it that, right? The home of the king and presumably the queen as well. And so it says, this is like line 125 or so, it says, they entered the sumptuous palace and found his wife inside, a woman huge as a mountain crag, who filled them all with horror. Straightway she summoned the king from assembly, who prepared my crew a barbarous welcome. Snatching one of my men, he tore him up for dinner. The other 2 sprang free and reached the ships. So once again here, we have a really interesting narrative of a perversion of guest friendship that somewhat tracks and parallels the Cyclops. So here again, we have men entering a home. They're actually invited into the home. And these humanoids, which we kind of find, the queen is large as a mountain crag, which was a charming, delightful image, right? They're giants. We find out they're cannibal giants. And so again, we have this perversion of guest friendship in which the host eats his guest. He does not feast his guest. The guest becomes the feast. We have this, broad theme of cannibalism, but I think the deeper theme here for the Homeric era is that we get this complete perversion, this horrific, disordered guest friendship. And so they run back and to tell Odysseus what's happened. But the trap has already been sprung. And this is where Odysseus loses his entire fleet, except his own ship. So remember, his ship is outside this harbor, this cove. And so these cannibal giants start throwing down boulders and all kinds of things to smash up the ships. And there's this, I keep using the word horrific, but that's what it is. There's this kind of horrific scene in which then, the men on these ships that have been smashed are all in the water and they're struggling in there. And the Laestrygonians then start kind of spearing them out, pulling them out. And Homer gives us this basically fishing imagery, right? That they're like spearing these fish. And they're pulling these men out of the water, then to be devoured by the cannibal giants on this island. And so the only ship that survives is Odysseus' ship, the ship that he instructed not to go in. And so this kind of raises, I think, a couple questions. One is a lot of people read this passage in a very positive light. And what I mean by that is they'll say, hey, look at Odysseus's cleverness. Look at his intuition for danger, right? He is a survivor. He has grit. He endures. And so look, everyone else just kind of went blindly into this cove, into this harbor, but he knew something was wrong, and so he held back. And this is, again, part of his coming home tale. This is part of his grit, his spiritedness, very much then coupled with his mind, with his intellect. And we should praise him for this. I think this kind of positive reading of Odysseus has merit. I think that it has a lot of things that are true about him and his capacities as a human being. But I think a lot of times on the negative side, that I think the positive side tends to neglect, is they forget that he's not just simply a sailor, right? He's not just simply one man amongst many. He's the leader. And so this kind of raises the question, why did he not instruct his fleet to do the same? Why did he not ask his fleet, hey, do not go inside that harbor. We don't know if this is a safe place. Don't go in there and harbor. My intuitions are telling me something. He doesn't do that. And so I think a lot of people here will submit a critique that Odysseus fails in his leadership. He does. He fails in his leadership. And because of that, this whole fleet of men, these men that had survived the Trojan War and many other hardships up to this point, suffer a gruesome death. They suffer a death of being speared and eaten by cannibal giants. So how do you read this? Do you read this in a positive light? Do you read this in a negative light? I think a lot of what Odysseus has done needs to be read in a certain light, that he is charged with his men. And if you remember, all the way back in the Iliad, Agamemnon did actually submit, not that he's the best source ever, but Agamemnon did actually submit a critique of Odysseus, that Odysseus basically uses others as a shield for his own self-preservation, right? That he actually uses others as a meat shield. And he gets critiqued about this in the Trojan War. Now, Odysseus fires back and critiques Agamemnon, and Agamemnon, if I remember right, kind of relents and says, I'm just trying to spur you into the battle. But now that we're in the Odyssey, we kind of see that doesn't seem to be empty rhetoric. That seems that actually there's a substantial critique here of Odysseus. And what is Odysseus willing to do to make it home? And is part of one of those things, to sacrifice his men? Is there something there, or at least not to care for them as much as he cares about himself? Now, let's push into this maybe a little deeper. This is where we get into just broad theories, we're speculating, etc. But I do think there's a question here that Odysseus has already accused his crew of being mutinous. That's something that I think we should really take to heart, because if they mutiny, he's not making it home, right? They're out on the open sea. He will die. And so, part of me then here is suspicious about, can you couple together Odysseus knowing that his crew has become mutinous, that their spirits are broken inside them, with him then not telling his ships to refrain from going into the harbor. And what I mean by this is that, does his ships become a liability to his journey home? Right? Do the ships then become a liability in which then if they mutiny, he's not making it home? And so him losing all these ships, his men, what he's actually doing is safeguarding himself from mutiny. He can handle his own crew. He can handle one ship. He can't handle a mutiny of a fleet. And of course, the juxtaposition here is that it was actually his own crew, his own men on his own ship that do survive, which are the ones that actually mutinied and opened up the bag of winds. So there's things to think about here. I think it's a narrative that certainly draws our attention to certain details and asks us the kind of question that we're always asking ourselves, which is, who exactly is Odysseus? Okay, let's look at the next island that they come to. And so now we just have one ship. We just have Odysseus' ship. And they come to a new island, which we're told by Homer is the home of Circe. And Circe is a goddess. She's an enchantress, right? She uses magic drugs and potions and herbs, right? She has very much a witch aesthetic, right, about her, outside the fact, though, that she is beautiful, right, as opposed to like our fairy tale witches. And so she is this goddess, and she uses these potions. And so, but they don't know that yet. They're just on this new island. But of course, given their last couple experiences, they are very wary about what might actually be here. So notice, though, again, we're tracking the relationship between Odysseus' men and his men. Odysseus goes out. And there's two things to note. He goes out to scout. He goes out to look. That seems good. That's leadership. But then he notices that there is a hall, and there are inhabitants on the island. There's smoke coming out of a hall. He doesn't want to go check it out, right? He actually says explicitly at line 170, I will go back and I'll send my men out to go scout, right? He's not going to take that risk himself. And then we get a narrative that I want to point out, a simple one. It's just that Homer gives us the detail that on his way back, Odysseus finds a large stag, right? A buck, a deer, a male deer. And he's able to take it down. And so he's bringing this back to his men, almost like a peace offering. Like, I'm going to feed you, and then I'm going to ask you to go do something that you clearly are not going to want to do. And this is exactly what happens. He goes back, he feeds them, and then he tells them that they need to go out and scout the island. And their response is very fascinating. If you look at like I don't know what this is, 218, it says, my message broke their spirits as they recalled the gruesome work of the Laestrygonians and the hardy cannibal Cyclops thirsting for our blood. They burst into tears, wailing, streaming live tears that gained us nothing. What good can come from grief? So a few things to note. One, there's that broken spirit again, that broken thumos, this ability inside the men, inside these warriors, right? I mean, these guys are veterans from Troy. It's broken. And it's very interesting that Homer now tells us explicitly why. One is the Laestrygonians, and the other one is the Cyclops, right? These two narratives, and certainly being so close to Ithaca as well, adds into this. Like, this has broken their spirits. They're crying, they're weeping, etc. They have not made it past these events. Odysseus seems to make it past them. And I mean, maybe, for lack of a better word, emotionally, he's already processed them. Because he's saying, listen, what's all this grief have to do? Like, this isn't going to afford us anything. Like, why are you crying? What's it matter? We have stuff to do. Now, granted, their reaction right now, one, is very similar to what we saw with him contemplating suicide after the bag of winds. So he's actually had his own temptation to grief. And now Odysseus doesn't seem nearly as bothered as he should be by the loss of his entire ship. He doesn't seem to be bothered by that. And maybe that goes into our theory that him not telling his fleet to not enter that cove was intentional on his part. It indirectly quelled a mutiny. His men, however, have not processed this. They are still emotionally broken. They're broken in their spirits. And so he kind of, I don't know if you want to say plays the middle here, but basically he says, well, let's let fate decide. So they break them into two groups. Odysseus will lead one group. Another man, I believe is it Eurylochus? Yes, Eurylochus will lead the other. and whichever one, fate decides through lottery will be the one that scouts. And lo and behold, it's not Odysseus's group. And so Eurylochus has to lead his group out. So they go and they find the hall, and they know immediately something's off. Why? Because there are large predators. It says there are, now granted, they're like, the men are, let's see, who's crying? Let's see. So he moved off with his 20 comrades, weeping, leaving us behind in tears. Okay, so both groups are weeping. Actually, the guys going off in the forest are weeping. The guys they left behind are weeping. Everyone's very weeping. Everyone has, did I say very weeping? Everyone is very weepy, and their spirits are broken. Right? So they go to the hall, as I said, and they know something's off. Why? Because there's large predators around that aren't antagonistic. They're not trying to attack them. It says there are large mountain wolves and lions roaming around the grounds, but they are docile. They're not trying to eat them. And then inside, they hear, or they're outside, for inside the hall, they hear beautiful singing. They hear a woman's voice singing. And the group becomes somewhat split. Eurylochus does not want to go in. He is just like, this cannot be good. We need to leave. This cannot be a good thing. And however, everyone else in his group, so that'd be what? The other 19, right? So actually the other 21 men decide, hey, we're going to go inside. And so Circe welcomes them to the hall. So now, once again, we have a theme of guest friendship. But what does she do? What does she do? She has a perversion of guest friendship because she feasts them, but she mixes into their food wicked drugs. And they kind of have two effects. One is it says the drugs to wipe away from their memories any thought of home. Now, this should sound somewhat familiar because this sounds like the lotus fruit, the lotus flowers, right? That Odysseus had to drag his men back to the ship because they ate this fruit, and the fruit took away their desire for home, right? They became lackadaisical. You might even say they became slothful, or they have acedia, right? They kind of forget their purpose. So here we see something similar. Her wicked drugs will cause these men to forget their journey home, to be complacent in where they are. There's a second effect, though, which is kind of more famous, which is it turns them all into pigs. So they're saying they're feasting, and they're turned all into these pigs. However, they do retain their minds. So now they're kind of stuck in this horrific situation in which they're in the bodies of pigs, but they have the minds of men. And this immediately makes us think of like, okay, that's probably what happened to the predators outside. Were they random animals that she entranced, or are they actually men? And that's why they're docile to other men, right? There's a big question on Circe's island of if there's an encounter with an animal, then wait, what do we think about this animal? Did this animal used to be a man? And I will leave you to contemplate that as we think about the stag that Odysseus shot and fed to his men earlier. Now, Eurylochus runs back, right? He's the one who didn't go in the hall, so he runs back to Odysseus. And notice, man, his spirit is broken. And you see a great juxtaposition here between Odysseus and Eurylochus. Because Eurylochus basically says, quit, cut and run. With the rest of us here, we can still escape the fatal day. Right? It's about right before line 300. So he says, leave them. We're done. Just leave the island, sail away. We can make it work. Like, forget them. Odysseus then says no. And this is where you see that spirited part of Odysseus, that part that makes him that hero, saying, no, I'm not going to leave my men here. And so he says, like, I'm going to go out and I will go to Circe's hall by myself. And so that's what he does. Now, on the way to the hall, he is intercepted by Hermes, the messenger god. This is the god that's kind of replaced Iris. If you remember in the Iliad, Iris, this kind of goddess associated with the rainbow, is constantly going back and forth between the gods, men, dreams, etc. But in the Odyssey, the mythology has shifted a little bit. Hermes now is this messenger god. He's playing this main role. And for the rest of mythology, into classical mythology, this is the role that he plays. So he comes down, and long story short, he tells Odysseus, hey, this is how you overcome Circe. And so he kind of tells him, like, this is what you need to counteract her spell. And so she'll try and do this to you. You will then be immune from the spell. And then we get this, which should remind us a little bit of Calypso. We get this narrative in which Hermes says she will cower in fear. And her response to this, she will then try to coax you to her bed. Then Hermes says, don't refuse her. Don't refuse the sexual invitation from the goddess. But, right, you need to actually, before you do that, need to make her swear an oath. So you will go to bed with her, but she has to swear an oath beforehand, right, not to harm you. And so this is what Odysseus says agrees to. And so this is exactly what happens when he goes into Circe's home. Now, there's an interesting, as an aside, Circe's home has a unique aspect. And that is like the main chair in Circe's home, and this is the chair that Odysseus is going to sit in several scenes, is a silver-studded chair. And why I point this out is because it triggered in me a certain association, which is the fact this is a silver chair in which mixed in with a theme of forgetting your purpose, of forgetting who you are, right? So you sit in this chair, you're fed this food, and then you forget who you are. You forget who or what your purpose is. Some of you have probably already clicked on this, which is C.S. Lewis wrote a whole book called The Silver Chair. And without going into all the details, if you haven't read it, it's one of the Narnia series, is that if you sit in the silver chair or you're bound to it, you then forget who you are. You forget your identity. You are transformed, if you will, into someone else. And this just seems too parallel with what we're seeing in Circe. And so it's an open question for me. I wasn't able to confirm it, but it's an open question whether C.S. Lewis draws from this passage in his own writings in Narnia. So Odysseus obeys Hermes, and so we see this play out exactly as he said. Around 365, right, Circe says, you have a mind in you, no magic can enchant. So again, we're going back to this theme of Odysseus' mind, his intellect, his cleverness. Now, in this context, his intellect is bolstered by the counter drug that Hermes told him to take. And so it's not just his natural intellect can't be enchanted through Circe's mix, but rather it's been bolstered basically by the gods indirectly. And then we get a really interesting thing that Hermes is basically playing both sides. Hermes had also gone to Circe and said that a man, right, named Odysseus would come and that, this was going to happen. So she immediately relents, and she does. She invites him to go to bed together, to mount my bed and mix in the magic work of love. Will breed deep trust between us. And so Odysseus obeys. He says he won't do this until the goddess will bind herself to an oath never to plot any new intrigue to harm him. That's at like 382 or so. And Circe acquiesces. She says yes, that she would never do any harm to Odysseus. And then it says, I mounted Circe's gorgeous bed. So I think there's a lot of things here to point out. One is, notice that the oath is just for Odysseus. It's not for Odysseus and his men. Now, his men will be restored. We'll see that here in a bit. But I find it intriguing that it's just a oath just to not harm Odysseus. And I wonder if there would be any practical effect, because we'll have to see in later books what happens to everyone. But I wonder at this juncture whether there was any practical effect if Odysseus would have made Circe swear to not harm him and his men. Right? Is that dispositive in any way? Would that actually add to anything? I think it's a question that we could ask. The other one here is guest friendship again. So clearly he's not turned into a pig. But now we have this theme of sexuality. So we have this twice now, where, now remember, he has, in the narrative that he's telling, he hasn't been to Calypso's island yet. That comes at the end of his journey. Remember, because he leaves Calypso's island, and that's how he ends up making it to King Alcinous's court. But right now he's in King Alcinous's court retelling his story. So he hasn't been to Calypso yet. And so he hasn't been to Calypso's island yet. Right now he's with Circe. And so we're kind of seeing a theme here then of when he is hosted then by these female goddesses, right? Sexuality seems to play a strong role. He sleeps with Calypso, he sleeps with Circe as well. And so, what do we make of this? Is there anything to be made of this? Is this a perversion of guest friendship? Like, what does this mean? Obviously, for this male context in kind of this Greek mythology, this Greek retelling, right? The hero being able to bed a Greek goddess, right, is this great accomplishment. Odysseus kind of takes it to another level in which this is something that he can walk away from. This is a pleasure that, even though he gives into, if you want to use that language, he also seems to have the capacity then to say no. We'll see him do that with Circe. And so far as that, we know he has to leave Circe's island at some point because he's in King Alcinous's court now. So we'll see how he makes that transition. But we also see it with explicitly of Calypso, not only denying her that pleasure of sexuality that she offers him, but also even immortality, which is then a whole nother temptation of his. I think the sexuality that we see, played in the guest friendship when a female god, a goddess, is actually the host, I think this plays in heavily to the theme of place, right? And as I just mentioned, the sexuality, the sexual pleasure becomes a temptation for him to stay. Because that's the whole thing. He needs to journey home. He needs to go back to Penelope, his wife, to Telemachus, his son. He needs to go retake his throne and restore good order to Ithaca. And so this is another, I think, temptation in which sexuality is a temptation to stay where you are. And we actually see this temptation played out pretty heavily on Circe's island, and we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so next, what we see is that now there's a truce, if you want to call it that, between Circe and Odysseus. And of course, then you're probably thinking, well, what about all his men that are turned into pigs? So half the men, practically speaking, are turned into pigs here in Circe's island, and the other half are back on the ship. So how do we rectify this? Well, first, he does ask, this is line 425 or so, right, that he can't sit here and feast. He can't actually be happy in Circe's home, even though it has all these pleasures, which includes herself, if his men are actually still out in the sty, turned into pigs. And so Circe acquiesces to his request, and she anoints them with a new magic oil, right? These kind of potions, and she enchants them back, or she undoes her enchantment, and they turn into men. And just notably, they happen to be younger and taller and more handsome than they were when they were actually turned into pigs in the first place. And so there's now this painful longing for tears overcame us all, and a terrible sobbing echoed through the entire house. The goddess herself was moved, right? And so now they become guests in her home. They are feasted, they are taken well of, there's these pleasures. And Odysseus actually goes back then to the ship that's on the shore and invites the rest of his men to come up and be guests in Circe's home. Something to note here, around 470, a little after that, is what about old Eurylochus? What is he going to think about this? Well, he's not keen on it. And so Odysseus invites them back. He says, see our friends in the magic hall of Circe, eating and drinking, the feast flows on forever. Eurylochus has what Odysseus calls in his retelling a mutinous outburst, in which he says, poor fools, where are we running now? Why are we tempting fate? Why stumble blindly down to Circe's hall? She'll turn us all into pigs or wolves or lions, made to guard that palace of hers by force, I tell you. Just as the Cyclops trapped our comrades in his lair, with hot-headed Odysseus right beside them all. Thanks to this man's rashness, they died too. So here, that tension is becoming explicit. The tension that we've had between Odysseus and his men in the rest of Book 10, or the earlier part of Book 10, that we've seen, that we think they're coming off the Cyclops narrative. They have the Bag of Winds. They have the Laestrygonians. We're seeing this kind of implicit tension. There's accusations of mutinous behavior. Now we see in Eurylochus's speech an explicit blaming of Odysseus for what's going on. He's hot-headed. He's not actually thinking these things through, right? And who's suffering? Well, Odysseus somehow seems to always make it out. But who doesn't make it out? The men. That's who suffers. They lost 6 of their men under the Cyclops, if I remember correctly. And then they lost the entire fleet, save Odysseus' ship, to cannibal giants in the Laestrygonians. And so, Eurylacus, I don't know. I'm sympathetic to him. I'm particularly the first time I read the Odyssey, I was terribly sympathetic to him. Because I had brought in my own narratives, right? You hear about Odysseus, his journey home, etc. I was expecting, I don't know, a Hector character, right? This just kind of like naturally virtuous man who's going to go home to his wife and, restore order to his kingdom. And now we see this man whose leadership I think is deeply complicated, raises a lot of questions, and then he's just sleeping with goddesses like on the way home. And so, like, what does this mean? And again, a lot of people would push back into that and say, well, in the Greek culture, like the man is not really bound as much as like the females would, right? The women, the wives have to be very faithful as we would contextualize it, but the men certainly don't. And if you get the opportunity to mount a goddess's bed, then you take that opportunity. And so my pushback on that is that we're not relativists, right? Or I'm not a relativist. And so while the Greeks certainly have their culture, human nature, right? Odysseus, as much as he's a historical person, particularly for what that matters, he's a person presented by Homer, right? In this narrative, we share human nature, and natural law plays into that, right? We're all rational animals, and we believe that marriage, right? Catholics believe that marriage is a natural institution. Now, it's broader than we would typically think, right? We see in the Old Testament, a man having multiple wives, but it is always in this context of a man and a woman, right? Or women. It's in this context, this heterosexual context. But then also there is a faithfulness to them, right? That they've made some type of pledge and institution. So I don't know. I don't want to give him. I'm sensitive to the critiques of like, you can't bring and read in a strong Christian morality from like the New Testament into Homer. I'm sensitive to that because I would argue that Homer is the beginning in a certain way of the contemplation of natural virtue, right? That was a big theme when we talked about the Iliad, that Homer is comparing, I think very explicitly, Achilles and Hector. And we're really starting to ask ourselves, what does it mean to actually be an excellent human? What does it actually mean to be a good man? I think this conversation is a lot more complicated in the Odyssey, simply because in the Iliad, we had a foil, right? You have Achilles and you have Hector, and Homer's very much comparing these two. But in the Odyssey, we very much just have one main character who's very complicated. And so sometimes he does things that seem very good, sometimes he does things very bad, and sometimes it's hard then to parse out, like, what is Homer the teacher trying to show us here? I think another critical thing that I would point out is, Odysseus is retelling this story, and I think it's really funny that he basically tells his audience, like, Hermes said I had to sleep with Circe, right? He told me I had to do this. And I think that, a lot of people question the veracity of the tales, or at least just want to point out that the man of twists and turns is retelling a story, and it's a story that he's the only person who survived. And so we should probably have a healthy skepticism about some of the things he says. Oh, which reminds me of another motif that we didn't mention earlier. Odysseus falling asleep. Notice, remember, that he falls asleep with a bag of winds. And so you say, well, what does that matter? Well, this is going to become a motif. It's going to become a pattern. What I mean by this is Odysseus tends to fall asleep at key moments of the narrative, particularly when his men decide to do something profoundly stupid. And so, again, we kind of question, like, he's the leader. In a certain way, he knows he's responsible for the men. So then how do you have your men do something really dumb when you're the leader? Well, somehow you have to remove yourself from the narrative where it's not actually your fault. And so we should probably flag, we should just note that there's a theme of sleep that comes into the narrative, in which Odysseus is going to fall asleep at key points. And we can just simply have a healthy skepticism about whether or not that's actually accurate. So let's look at the Circe narrative again. So the men have been restored. And so now the men from the shoreline, right? Even Eurylacus, he kind of struggles behind. He doesn't stay at the ship. We should note, however, that in 485 or so, that Odysseus's initial response to Eurylacus is to kill him, is to slice off his head. And the reason he doesn't do it is because the other men intervene and tell him not to. So Odysseus takes his men and tells Eurylacus, you can basically stay here with the ship. Odysseus and the men go back to the hall. Eurylacus decides not to stay with the ship and kind of lingers behind. And so now they're all being feasted. And our narrative does a huge jump that basically they are feasted for a year in Circe's hall. And notice here, this is, let's see here. This is 520. So they're feasted on sides of meat and draughts of heady wine. I'm a little skeptical of where all the meat comes from on Circe's island. That's something I think we should probably think about. Secondly, Odysseus seems to be content to be here, to be on the island. And it's his men, actually, that remind him of his purpose, of his journey home. So this is at 520. Captain, this is madness. High time you thought of your own home at last. If it is really your fate to make it back alive and reach your well-built house in native land. And so here, I think there's a certain comparison, because notice we've already had a narrative in which they forget their journey home. That was the lotus flowers, right? The fruit they ate. And so in that narrative, it was Odysseus who went and kind of grabbed them and crawled back with them, clawed them back to the ship. In this narrative, it seems to be Odysseus that has forgotten his journey home, and it's his men that step in to pull him back. I think that's a comparison worth noting. The other thing worth noting is, remember that Circe's drug had two effects. What were they? Well, one was that you forgot your purpose. You forgot your journey home. And the second one is that you were turned into you were turned into pigs. And so it's interesting here that Odysseus, even without being affected by the drugs, has fallen under the effect of Circe and has forgotten his own journey home. You could make an argument here that it clearly is the pleasures of Circe's house that have caused him to forget this, and that the drug actually that he's currently taking is Circe herself, right? She becomes the wicked, potent drugs. She becomes that to Odysseus, and through that kind of sexual relationship, right, that he's engaged in, that he had to do because of Hermes, he has now kind of forgotten his journey home. Now, to his credit, this wakes him up. His men kind of calling him out wakes him up. And so he says, yes, we should do this. He does blame the men when he tells Circe. He's like, listen, this is like 5:35 or so. He says, listen, they're wearing me out, right? They want to go home. They're wearing me out. We should probably go home. Circe's answer here is important because she sets up the entire next book, book 11, which we'll have a wonderful conversation with Dr. Frank Grabowski. Will be back, and so will Thomas Lackey, right? Both members of the Sunday Great Books group that I host at my home. They're going to join us for book 11 to work through the House of Death, because this is what Circe tells him. Okay, you can leave my island, but you have to go talk to the prophet Tiresias, this Theban seer, right? You have to go talk to him about how to make it home and what you need to do to appease the gods. Okay, that's great, but here's the one caveat. Tiresias is dead. So you actually have to journey into the house of death. You have to journey into Hades, the underworld, and talk to him directly. And as we kind of talk about spirits, we should definitely note that Odysseus's spirit, right, is kind of broken in this passage when she tells him this. Homer tells us that, this is Odysseus who's actually telling us this. He says, so she said, this is Circe saying about the house of death, and crushed the heart inside me. I knelt in her bed and wept. I had no desire to go on living and seeing the rising light of day. But once again, he pulls himself together, right? So even though his spirit is crushed, sometimes heart, the spirited, that thumos is also can be translated as heart, right? You have heart to do something. So even though he is crushed, he pulls himself together. He collects like that spiritedness, right? That grit, and says, okay, I will do this. I will travel down to the house of death. And so Circe gives him, if you kind of read through this passage, Circe gives him kind of a detailed thing of here's what you need to do, etc. It includes how he needs to actually make these sacrifices and talk to the gods, and that he has to have Tiresias, right? He needs to allow him, there's going to be a sacrifice that's made, there's blood that is spilt, and Tiresias needs to be the first one to drink of the blood. And we'll get into this in book 11. There's like this mechanic in the underworld of being able to drink the blood and to being able to speak. This seems to affect some spirits, but not others. And so that's something that we'll get into next week in book 11. And so Tiresias will then tell him how he is to make it home. And that will, whatever Tiresias tells him to do, that's what he has to do. And so that's the next stage in their journey. A few things here that I think are worth noting. This passage of Odysseus going into the house of death is really important in Western literature because in certain ways it creates a template. What I mean by this is that in Greek literature, and really in a certain way, it's ubiquitous to human literature. If you look in all kinds of cultures, they're going to have the same pattern, which is the true heroes, right? There's this pattern of being a true hero. The hero always has to kind of go somewhere and complete an adventure, and he has to journey home. And Thomas Lackey has been very good about helping us kind of understand this pattern, and he'll talk about it next week as well. But you see these patterns in which the hero has to find out who he is, he has to leave, go on an adventure, and he has to make it home. And you see this pattern is repeated even in modern literature, right? You can think of the Star Wars saga plays this out. You have to see with Lord of the Rings of Frodo going on his adventure. This really just becomes a ubiquitous thing of the hero's journey. And it's more complicated than that. It has deeper patterns that people tend to point out. But right here, I think what's important for us is the hero leaves, he goes on a journey, and he has to come back. And this is the whole cycle for him. You even see this in the entirety of the Iliad, right? Where they have the journey, they sack Troy, and then them making it back, which is the entire point of the Odyssey, is actually just as much a part of their journey. So like, for instance, Odysseus' journey back is very difficult, and he will gain a lot of glory and honor from being able to make it home to Ithaca, right? That's the kind of thesis that we're working with. Whereas opposed to someone like Agamemnon, right, his glory is mitigated because, yes, he did help sack Troy. He was the king of kings in Troy and that kind of Achaean army, but then he can't make it back home. Or he makes it back home and then he's killed by his own wife. And so he loses that glory. Now the only thing people remember of him is that he's killed by his own wife. They don't remember that he sacks Troy. So you have to do both things. You have to leave and you have to come back. So why do I mention this? I mention this because then you see that there's a pattern then of like, well, then clearly the greatest heroes would be the ones that go on the greatest adventures and then can come back. Well, what's a better adventure than defeating death? To journey into the underworld, into Hades, and then to make it back. That is like the premier heroic journey. And this becomes a template inside the heroic literature. Now, it doesn't originate with Odysseus. There's already been, there's actually multiple, but the most famous one is Heracles, or we often call him Hercules. He has a journey into the underworld. If I remember right, he actually journeys down there twice. One during his 12 labors, and then after the 12 labors, he journeys down to get the soul or the shade, the spirit of a queen, and comes back. And so Hercules then has this pattern of going into the underworld and coming back. And this becomes kind of like the hero's journey par excellence. And you see this then in later literature, that if you're going to have a hero, this is like the peak of the journey that he can do. We will see this, in however many years it takes us to get to the Aeneid. We'll see this with Aeneas. Aeneas has to go down into the underworld as well. If you remember Aeneas from the Iliad, right? He's the Trojan prince. He's the only member, not the only member, but he's the main line of the Trojan royal house that survives. He takes his father out as well, and then he becomes the founder of Rome. And this becomes a huge part of the myth in the Roman Empire. And then actually that myth then very much echoes throughout the Middle Ages as well, that Rome was basically founded by the Trojans. And so then the inheritance of the Roman Empire inside of Europe are also descendants from Troy, right? They track that genealogy, if you will, that heritage all the way through the medieval age. And so the other one that obviously comes to mind is Dante, right? Dante has what? This journey through the underworld, the entire Divine Comedy. But he's going to go through not only Hades or hell, right, the Inferno, but then also through purgatory, and then he'll have an ascension. He'll go up into the heavens before then returning, right? He doesn't die. This is a big thing. You don't die in the underworld. You don't just go down into the underworld. You have to come back. You have to have that hero's journey home. And so then he also, it's not really part of the Divine Comedy, but we know that he doesn't end his journey, right? He doesn't die in heaven. He actually has to go back to earth and then live out his earthly pilgrimage. So this becomes a template, and there's all kinds of examples of this in literature, and it really is somewhat ubiquitous inside of human culture of having this hero's journey. Obviously, then there is a deep pivot here to the true narrative, to the true myth of Jesus Christ, in which Jesus Christ is the true hero who conquers death, who goes into Hades, who goes into the underworld, into hell, and conquers it. And so the greatest, right, the true myth that all these other myths are somewhat foreshadowing or reflecting or trying to illuminate is then the journey of our Lord into hell, right? The harrowing of hell, in which he destroys the powers of death, right? He doesn't go down and suffer, right? He goes down as a victor, and he defeats the powers of hell. Dante will talk about like the gates being broken. Like you could see where he walked through hell and destroyed things. And our first pope, St. Peter, then also tells us, right, that one of the things that our Lord did when he went into hell was to preach to the souls down there, right? Because there was a part of hell, limbo, Abraham's bosom, right, Sheol, in which the souls of the righteous, the virtuous, went, and it was a paradise. It's without punishment, right? It's not, we think of hell, we think of punishment. There's no punishment there. But they were deprived of the vision of God. They weren't with God. They didn't have the beatific vision. And they can't have that, right, until Christ unlocks that for them with his passion, with the cross and his resurrection. And so when our Lord goes down into heaven, or excuse me, when he goes down into hell, he preaches to the souls in limbo into Abraham's bosom. And so this is like Adam and Eve and Moses and David, but also all the virtuous souls, right, the ones that we don't know about. Even pagans, if you will, right? And he takes them up into heaven with him, right? And there's this great kind of triumph of our Lord over death. And so it's interesting that this truth about our Lord then is echoed inside of not just amongst the Greeks, but inside of Greek literature, inside Roman literature, but also even if you look at a lot of the Eastern literature and some of India's thing, like this is just a ubiquitous, constant theme that the hero has to be able to journey into death and come back. And so this is what Book 11 is going to be. Book 11, our next book, is going to be Odysseus's journey into death. Okay, what else can we note about Book 10? All right. Looking at the guide, going back to the guide, seeing if I missed anything. Again, we have this wonderful question and answer guide to the Odyssey available on our website if you'd like to go look. So just 3 things that I think we need to mention. 1, Circe singing in the hall is somewhat of a foreshadowing, right? There's this temptation to come into the hall into danger. A lot of people might know about the sirens because they're kind of in our culture, we know about them. The sirens are these female creatures that will sing and tempt the Odysseus and his crew to basically jump overboard to their death, right? They have this wonderful, beautiful song that is this temptation. We'll get into them when they get into the Odyssey. I think right now it's sufficient here to say that Circe singing in the hall and luring the men in is somewhat of a foreshadowing, or at least a very similar event to the sirens themselves. 2, the second thing that I would call to attention is that, we're kind of wrapping up book 10, and then around line, a little bit before 610, we get that one of Odysseus's men die. Old Elpenor, right? He has kind of an odd death. He basically gets drunk and decides to sleep on top of Circe's house. And then in the morning, when they're all like, hey, we got to go off to the house of death, he forgets he's on the roof and runs off and falls and breaks his neck. This is a weird narrative. It's a weird little narrative pericope that's kind of stuck here at the end of book 10. You need to pay attention to it because Elpenor comes back. Where are we going in book 11? The House of Death. Who just died? Elpenor. So just watch this narrative. He's going to become a character that we need to watch in book 11. He's circling back. And then the last thing I think that we need to note is that when Odysseus tells his men, we've kind of seen this pattern, right? Of Odysseus has to process something, and then later he tells his men. We see the same thing happen again. He has to tell his men that they are going down to the house of death, right? They're not sailing to Ithaca. She didn't tell them how to get home, per se. She said, no, you have to sail to the ends of the world. You have to sail to the house of death, to Hades. In around 625, it says, so I said, and it broke my shipmates' heart. They sank down on the ground and moaned and tore out their hair. But it gained us nothing. What good can come from grief? Okay, so we've seen that line before. So that's actually not too far off from what I think Odysseus' response was to Circe, right? That his heart was broken. So again, we see this pattern where Odysseus is told something, he has this emotional reaction, which I think is reasonable, and he processes it. His spirit endures, and he has this grit. And then his men have the response, and he's not exactly the most sympathetic or empathetic character, right? He's like, what does this grief do? This isn't going to help us. And so then, but it does say, though, as they kind of sail off to the house of death, that our spirits, not just his men's, but our spirits were in deep anguish. And that's how we leave them as they go into book 11. So I appreciated being with you all today. Thank you for joining us for book 10 of the Odyssey. Please go visit our website, thegreatbookspodcast.com. And we have a whole library there that you can look, and we have articles and other resources about the great books on the Odyssey, on many other things. And we will see you next week for book 11. Thank you, everyone.